we're still working with technical issues on with our speaker, so I'm not going to share my screen.
Yeah, but we lost Damon.
No, he's here.
I
No,
see him.
we lost
He
his
just
screen.
stopped sharing. He's still working it. But you can still put in the chat, even if I don't have it up there. Please put in the chat where you're viewing from and what migrants you're seeing. Man, I've been seeing some fun pictures on social media. Some fallout last week. Let us know what you're seeing. Anybody? 8 to 9 swallow. Oh, Margie. She saw swallowtail kites. Kylie. My favorite was probably the blue-winged warblers at
Ooh,
Pinecraft. How
super.
cool is that? So, Margie, you're finally getting your kites. Is that in your neighborhood? I know you were worried about not seeing them.
Yeah, I have a network of intelligence now. My alerted neighbors.
Good.
And they found them in a lovely place where they were calling to me as I was driving over. Or under.
Did you just see one or several or what?
No, I saw 8 or 9.
Oh no! Wow.
Yeah, so
Oh,
that's
lovely.
Great.
yeah.
Oh, the
All right,
most
who
I've
else?
You
seen.
did it, Damon. You're doing it.
Well, he's doing it, but he won't be able to. Yeah, it's kind of weird. All right, who else besides Kylie is seeing some cool birds? Did she scare you off with her blue-winged warblers? We want to know what else is out there. All right. Damon, if you want to, are you still figuring or do you want to stop? I would like to share my screen.
I'll just go this way.
All right, so if you would stop, and I'm going to share my screen for a second or two. So Jean's going to run a brief meeting, and then we will, because we have to have election of officers this.
Got some business.
Got some business, yeah. We lost Margie. What happened?
I'm here. I'm off video.
Oh, you just went off. Okay, okay. Well, it would help if I opened my PowerPoint. Where is it? Here we go. Share. And
Okay, we all set here. Shall we wait a few more minutes, Karen, before more folks come in, or where are we?
we have, let's see. I have
33.
33.
We still need to hear from people what they're seeing, though.
I know it's working because we heard from Kylie. So come on, tell us what you're seeing, guys. Jean saw a swallowtail kite at the celery fields and least bitterns. Fun.
The least bitterns are breeding now, so you can wait all year long and never see them. But right now, from I believe the Raymond Road Boardwalk, you can see them if you look. And so we know they're nesting there, which is really exciting.
Yeah, Raymond Road is really good. There are blackneck stilts.
Yes.
And you never know with Raymond Road.
Oh.
Huh. Is the chat not working?
Yeah, no, it's working.
It's working. Well, yeah, because Kylie was able to.
People are being shy today.
I guess.
Actually, it's not working super well. I can't get back and it's blurry.
Oh, we see you fine. It's your computer. You're fine.
I'm not, no, it's this. It may be the underlying program that's not, it's blurry.
No, I'm typing one into there now.
Chantal is seeing robins and cardinals in Canada, waiting for the migrants to return home, of course. Well, we're glad you're here visiting us or watching us from Canada. All right, well, I guess, painted buntings are dwindling at the gazebo.
At the nature center.
Mhm.
So Anjan Zhu saw Duncan's in Guatemala. Fun.
What are
never-
Duncan's?
I don't
I've
know.
never met a
There's
Duncan.
at Dunlan's.
Oh, maybe Dunlin. Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Being in Guatemala, lucky you.
Mhm.
Oh my gosh, I wish I were there.
Yeah, Jean, you and I should go with.
I
plan a trip.
know, I know. What are we doing here? We should go there.
All right. Okay. So I'm going to go to the next slide because we have lots to do today. And tomorrow is the day, starting at noon tomorrow. So please consider, if you're going to donate to the Giving Challenge, to donate to us. And I will put a plug in for Damon as well, because he has a new nonprofit, Oyster River Ecology. You're going to learn all about it, and he is participating.
That's
So-
wonderful. And do people, what do they click on, Karen, tomorrow?
Tomorrow, I will send at 10 o'clock, I'll send, but any of the last in the Brown Pelican, that was a live link also where it says wait until
Okay.
Tuesday. If you click on that, it'll
Right,
take you to our giving partner page. So
right.
and on the website tomorrow, the only thing in the banner, if you click the banner, the only thing that will be on from noon to noon will be the Giving Challenge. So you can go to Sarasota Audubon to find us as well.
And the Patterson Foundation has come through yet again with doubling your donation up to $100. I don't know if that's for everybody or just for unique donors, but give it a try. And there is another couple, I'm afraid I have lost their names, who are also putting in some matching features. So whatever you give, we'll get more of it, which is really wonderful. So noon tomorrow, get in there and start donating.
All right.
There's
And
Margie with her kites. Okay, so this April is the general meeting of the Sarasota Audubon Society, and every year we elect our officers for the year beginning June 1st. And the elected offices are president, first vice president, second vice president, secretary, and treasurer. And right now, thanks to Karen and Don Schneider, who have agreed again to be on nominating committee, the people who have upped again are Catherine Young, first VP, Lynn Jacobowitz, second VP, Mary Hyland, secretary, and Andy Schneider for treasurer. The president position is open, so we're always looking for somebody to fill that spot. And what we always say is you will never be on your own. You will always have a tremendous amount of help in whatever position you're in. Karen has developed a, it's not SurveyMonkey.
it's not SurveyMonkey. I had to, at the last minute, sorry, it's called Survey Planet. And I'm going to send it through Constant Contact to those of you who are members and attendants tonight. So I'm going to double check the people who are here, make sure you're members. So if you get an email, please vote, because according to the bylaws, you have to be present at this meeting.
Jean,
And also, isn't there a place on the ballot for additional nominees?
Yes.
So if anybody is out there and wants to run for any of these positions, put your name in the hat and indicate what position you are interested in. So let's do it.
Jean, can you please explain why you're not rerunning for president?
Well, the reason
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we love you so much. It's hard to see you not as president.
No, I know, but it's time for me to step down and for somebody else to take over. I've been doing it for so long that it's becoming a life sentence, and I have plans this coming year to do some major traveling. And as I said, I will probably, the new board will decide on a title for me, because I will still be heavily involved in Audubon, especially on the quad project. So I'm not running away from you. That Audubon has been in my heart for 25 years. I'm certainly not abandoning you, but it's really time for somebody else to step up. So
Yes.
don't be shy, do it.
Yep.
Okay, so
All right. I'm going to stop sharing. And yeah, look in your inbox. Probably give me about 20 minutes or so after the meeting ends, and it will be open until 9 o'clock tomorrow night. So if you don't have time tonight and want to do it tomorrow, that's fine. All right.
Okay, lovely. Thank you for doing that, Karen, again, figuring out that program.
Yeah.
Sort of a last minute. Okay. All right,
Okay.
so there we are. I think it's Margie's turn to introduce our wonderful speaker tonight. And there you go.
So it's my pleasure to introduce Damon Moore, who currently runs the Oyster River Ecology. And Damon is the founder and executive director of this nonprofit, amazing new nonprofit business in Bradenton. It's project-focused environmental organization that was formed to increase the amount of on-the-ground and in-the-water projects being done in the Suncoast area for the purpose of restoring habitats and improving ecological functions. So Damon is our favorite local ecologist. If you don't know him, you need to. He's known to us all for all the work he's done and continues to do. He's a habitat restoration practitioner with 20 years of experience developing and implementing local habitat restoration projects, including one that I worked on with him with the Conservation Foundation in Manatee County, Johnson Preserve. It was really fun walking around with Conservation Foundation, Lee Amos, and with Damon. You should have seen them with their close to the ground looking at all the plants and the butterflies. It was really fun. I happened to be a fly on the wall with them while they were doing their inspection. His career has included 10 years working in the private sector in consulting, and then 10 years working for Manatee County government within the Natural Resources Department. It's their loss he's not there anymore. And since I live in Manatee County, I'm sorry about that, but I'm thrilled for Damon that he's got his new business. Damon played an instrumental role in local large-scale habitat restoration projects, including the restoration of Perico Preserve and the Robinson Preserve expansion project for Manatee County, among many other habitat improvement projects across the region. He is a certified ecological restoration practitioner, and I hope you'll tell us more about that. Through the Society for Ecological Restoration, Damon enjoys spending time with his lovely wife and daughter, as well as fishing, hiking, uploading plant and insect observations in iNaturalist, and volunteering on habitat restoration projects all over the local area. So take it away, Damon.
All right. Do you see a presentation on the screen?
We sure do.
Okay,
Looks
this
good.
is as best as I could get it, zooming everything out. So
You did a good job of it, Damon.
we're gonna work through it. Let me see if I can do one thing here. So I was so excited because I really love telling the story about this project. I think a lot of you've probably heard me do presentations on Perico Preserve and Robinson Preserve, and if you have, you know, I always like to dig into the history of things before trying to plan how to fix it. So when I dove into this one in particular for oysters in the Manatee River, it was just a lot of really cool stuff. So I'm going to try and blast through this stuff because Margie already gave you a pretty good introduction of me. But I got a really early start with ecological restoration projects, really at a place that the birding community knows and loves at Lefis Key out on the south end of Anna Maria Island. I was one of those kids out there with care and leading groups even back then, that, you know, they said, here, we're going to plant some mangroves and these are good for fish and water quality. And that kind of clicked with me early on, that here's, something you can do and make a difference in the world, but also get to play in the mud a little bit. I didn't realize how much paperwork and desk time was involved back then. But that was really like my first project where the light bulb kind of went off for me was like back, 1991, I think that was. But I was also, I went to high school locally at Bayshore High School, and I had a teacher there, Reinhardt Bada, who really kind of fostered that in me and supported, but also was a very like action oriented and results focused person. So, while I was there, every Monday we were out seining in the bay to catch creatures and keep them in tanks and learn about them. But we also created a wetland from the stormwater runoff that came off the roof of the building back then. So I got my taste of moving dirt to create wetlands pretty early on. As Margie mentioned, there's a big project in Manatee County in the last 10 or 15 years, I've kind of had something to do with it, one thing or the other. But really with the starting of the nonprofit organization, it's really to try and bring more large scale habitat restoration projects. I've been doing a lot of work with Felts at the Manatee County Audubon, with their new leadership there. They are kicking it into high gear. That's been a lot of fun. Obviously this project I'm presenting on tonight, but also other oyster restoration areas, and really to find those niches where there's potential for beneficial restoration, but the people that manage those properties maybe don't have a background in that, or know how to go get grants to make bigger things happen. That's really the niche I'm trying to fill there right now. So enough about me. This is about oysters, and for a lot of this presentation to make sense, we have to do a quick 101 oyster life cycle review. So as we go through the presentation, you'll realize why this is necessary. So we're going to start with a boy oyster and a girl oyster on a romantic moonlit evening when the temperature of the water reaches just above 68 degrees. And oyster love happens, and their gametes are released into the water column where they become fertilized. This goes, and they're in the water column floating around for about 3 weeks as free swimming larvae. Eventually, those free swimming larvae are going to land on one of two things, something hard or something not hard. If it lands on something hard, the spat will settle and start growing into an adult oyster, as long as something else doesn't eat it along the way. If it lands on something soft, like unconsolidated sand bottom or mud or something like that, it does not grow. It becomes fish food or worm food or something else like that. But the main thing to remember is that it needs to land on something that's hard. So we'll go through a little bit on why oysters are great, why people love them. This is a very often used graphic to show that. Most people know that the filtration capacity of oysters is one of the major benefits. Most of the time people will say an oyster can filter 50 gallons of water per oyster per day. In a lab under absolutely ideal conditions, that's absolutely the truth. It's something that a lot of us who do oyster restorations like to throw that number out there because it's big and it's easy to remember. But the in situ studies are more like 3 to 12 gallons of water per oyster per day, because it's not always ideal in the real world. But really the focus I have is whether it's 3 gallons or whether it's 50 gallons, let's just put enough oysters out there to start making a big difference. But the benefits to that is it removes plankton and sediments from the water column, making it clearer. And when you have clear water, more light gets to the bottom. So you have increased seagrasses, which kind of snowballs into less sedimentation. So the filtration benefits are definitely there, and they're proven. And it is fun to take the oysters into a dirty tank like this, toss them in, because they definitely do clear it out. It's a really fun one to do in classrooms. So usually when I do the programs, I'll bring live ones out and show them that in real time. So yeah, this is a kind of a complicated graphic, but I'll walk you through it a little bit. This is probably one of the most important benefits locally to what oyster restoration really can bring, is because oysters have the capacity to remove nutrients from the water. And this is the same nutrients that fuels these red tide events. This is not it's not like this is going to solve all those problems, but it is a piece of the puzzle. So the way they do this is a little bit, it's not completely intuitive, because you have to remember that oysters are themselves, they're animals. So they have a nitrogen waste product themselves. So the way this works is that they are filter feeders. So the nitrogen sources or the nutrient sources are up, they're taken up by phytoplankton in the water column. Oysters are filter feeding, so they take that phytoplankton in, and then they assimilate that into their tissues, and through their own metabolic processes, like I said, they have a nitrogenous waste product through their what's called pseudofeces that's ejected from the side of the oyster and makes its way beneath the oyster bar. And that's really where the magic happens with this, because that oyster bars themselves on the bottom create an environment that harbor specific types of bacteria, and those bacteria actually convert that biologically available nitrogen, nitrites and nitrates into nitrogen gas, which then goes off into the atmosphere, and it cannot be used by those red tide organisms and harmful algal blooms like that. So really got to thank the Florida Sea Grant folks for working this into a very complicated series of events, but they put this nice graphic together for that. So that's about as sciencey as I'm going to get with you guys. I like this slide better because these are things I can really wrap my head around easy, is the fisheries benefits. With oysters out there, they're ecosystem engineers. They increase the complexity and increase just the abundance of life around there. That's all. That's a good thing for recreational fishing. That's obvious with anybody who does recreational fishing. When you're going by oyster bars, you're usually stopping because those are areas that usually hold fish. This is also something that's very good for commercial fishing. And this is actually applicable in the context of the Manatee River, where we're looking to start a lot of this restoration, because there is an active blue crab fishery that goes on in that area. And really the benefit for that is there's like in the Chesapeake, where they've done a lot of oyster restoration in the past, they've studied this extensively. And in those systems where they've done large scale restoration, they find 152% increase in the blue crab fishery after they do the oyster restoration, which makes sense because blue crabs, for one, they eat oysters, but they also eat all of the other organisms that live into the interstitial spaces that oyster reefs create, like the worms and other smaller crabs and everything else. But for me, like and I think for a lot of you folks that have this appreciation, is they increase biodiversity. And this is really easy to tell if you go like stick your head down next to one of these things, you can hear it, because like when you go underwater next to an oyster reef, you hear all the cracking shrimp and it's just like a mini rainforest of life right there, compared to these open sandy bottom areas where there's just nothing. When you go down by these oyster reefs, it's obvious there's a lot of life there, not just in what you can see, but also in what you can hear. A benefit that's often associated with oysters, but probably should be associated with coastal restoration projects that also include oysters, is using oysters as a component for shoreline protection and sediment stabilization projects. The two photos of like the side-by-sides up here, these are this is the south side of MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa Bay. And it's a before and after shot. So this is at that south end. There's a lot of wind and wave exposure. The south end of the island basically started to wash away. They lost their mangrove fringe, and then as those winds would kick up, it just kept basically eating this shoreline further and further back. So these ongoing projects by MacDill Air Force Base and with Tampa Bay Watch, where they brought these structures in the bottom left, these are called oyster domes or reef balls. And you can see these little dots on this picture. These are all individual reef balls. So they put these out here, and these capture that wave energy. And when you put them at those right elevations, oysters tend to grow on them as well. So they do this like a number of methods with these oyster domes or oyster bags or oyster prisms or oyster mats like you see here. But you can see like on the with using these oyster domes when they put them out there like that, this was able to stop that energy hitting that shoreline and allow sediment accretion to start to occur so that these marshes could start to grow back behind it. So it's an impressive amount that like mostly volunteers came out set like building and then setting these things up to be able to kind of protect the Air Force base, but also start to actually regain some and build some increased resilience into this system. So the so that's off to the benefits. Now I'll start talking about some of the planning and then get into the history of what goes on to this. But I often get like a lot of people are like, wow, your projects are so amazing. How do you do it? I'm a big proponent of the Society of Ecological Restoration's guidance documents that they post out there because it's basically for ecological restoration practitioners. It's the professional organization that takes the time to kind of talk to everybody, see what works, what doesn't, and they have very, very smart people put together these guidance documents to help guide these restoration projects. So they're out there. So basically, when I'm doing like the Robinson Preserve and Perico Preserve, it was just kind of following the recipe to make sure you're checking all the boxes first. But one thing they always stress is to really understand and become familiar with the ecosystem, and especially the historic ecology of these areas. Because if you don't understand what throughout history has caused the decline of the system you're trying to restore, you're not going to be well informed in trying to determine solutions for that, and especially sustainable solutions, because those drivers that cause the decline may still they may still be at play there. So if anybody's like interested in kind of the deep dive into ecological restoration stuff, definitely check out Society of Ecological Restoration's webpage and a lot of their guidance documents out there. But they built this one specific to shellfish reefs, and this one just came out a couple of years ago. And this has been really good in helping plan my restoration projects geared towards oysters. So as I started digging into this project for Manatee River oysters, I realized that this is a very common term in ecology is the concept of shifting baselines. And basically what that is that our baseline understanding of what an ecosystem is and what's in it is really kind of dependent on how we grew up understanding it. So the image to the left, like 29, like I think of this a lot from my own. So like I kind of grew up in this area in the late 80s, early 90s. That was where I kind of gained my view of what these systems are. So for me, it was like there weren't like fish kills. There were some oysters in the Manatee River. So you kind of get this feeling like, well, maybe there's not a huge problem, but really that's based in not knowing the history of what these systems used to be in a more pristine condition. And pretty much with everything in the natural world, the further back you go, the more off we are from it in the current state. So with oysters, it's not just locally. That this is a global thing. An estimated 85% of oyster habitats have been lost worldwide over the past 200 years. And with most of that in this area being done before 1900, it's easy to kind of lack an understanding of the targets we should be aiming for. But really the thing that really brought that on was like when I started diving into history and looking for old maps, this one from 1837, right here where the Manatee River goes in and the Braden River goes back down, called the Manatee River the Oyster River. So I started like, that was like, okay, that's a bizarre thing. There's oysters in it, but it certainly doesn't deserve the name Oyster River. So with all these, I started digging further back into history. And this was the first historical reference, the oldest historical reference I was able to find about the Manatee River. And this comes from dates back to 1793. And it's a letter from Vicente Fulch to the most excellent Senor de Luis de las Cabas. I don't know if that's completely right or not, but basically, Vicente Fulch was going up and down the west coast of Florida, looking for areas to put a garrison, because this is when Florida was owned by the Spanish, and they were looking for areas to kind of fortify that. So in that letter, this part obviously is translated back, is so proceeding further up the bay, one finds the river called Talachacpu by the Indians, and by the Spaniards, River of Oysters, on the account of the many of these which block its entrance. And so I thought that, that's an interesting idea, that there'd be so many oysters at the mouth of the Manatee River that you wouldn't be able to navigate past them even back then. It certainly is nothing like that these days. But with all these historical things, you can't stop reading, because one of the things that they talk about just after that is entering the river, one finds a delicious spring that comes up through a rock orifice 20 inches in diameter. And this is a reference to Manatee Mineral Springs. It basically said this was the only area around here suitable for settlement, was right there by the Manatee Mineral Springs. We didn't follow that, obviously. We're building all over the place. So as I dug a little bit further, I wanted to see, like, okay, was that just a misnomer? Was it not even the correct river? Because there is a lot of misinterpretation between the Manatee River and the Little Manatee River in historical terms. So this was the first official government document that I found related to oysters in this area. And this was from John Smeltz, and he worked for the organization that was the predecessor to the National Marine Fisheries Service through NOAA. And he was basically tasked with going all over Florida and documenting what the oyster conditions were. So when he talks about, like, when he, all these rivers around here, the big Manatee, Little Manatee River, described it as oysters everywhere, which is a very qualitative approach. But the thing that really caught my eye was the next sentence, where he said, "How little did I think that in less than 25 years, every one of these bars would be partially or totally depleted." So I thought that was, like, in a 25-year time frame, from going to describing this as just like oyster abundance beyond your wildest dreams to, yeah, we've destroyed them all. I was worried, is this guy exaggerating a little bit? So obviously you keep digging and you keep trying to find other information. So this was where I learned that the Library of Congress, through a program called Chronicling America, had taken thousands of historical newspapers and digitized them and made them word searchable, so that you can put in little key terms and find out all kinds of crazy stuff that dates way back into history. So a lot of these came from the Savannah Morning News in the mid to late 1800s, because we didn't have those newspapers in Florida yet. But these two were very interesting. This one from 1876 noted a semi-weekly line of steamers to Manatee with oyster and fish trade. So I had never thought of the Manatee River, or really anything in our area, as being like a commercial harvest for food oyster area. That was always like, oh, that's Apalachicola or around Louisiana. But then other references came along too, with heavy shipments of oysters being made from Palmasola. And knowing that at that time in the late 1800s, the Palmasola dock was kind of a hub of commerce, where a lot of things got onto steamships and moved their way into market up to Tampa and down to Cuba. But then it got very, very specific and personal about Mr. Smeltz's comment that we had totally destroyed everything. This was this was from 1900, and a little snippet where they would just have like these little paragraphs of what was happening in different parts of Florida. And this one, the Manatee Journal, said oyster culture should receive large attention by property owners on the waters of Manatee County. The natural beds have been destroyed, and for several years the supply must be very limited. Which I thought was like, okay, now there's a very specific call out that you have destroyed what you had, And this was 1900, so obviously there's not much environmental regulation, if any at all, going on. So if there's free money and oysters to be had out there, people were doing it. And then, as always, I tried to find any kind of visual references to that, and the closest I found was from the Manatee County's postcard collection, and this one dated 1915, of a gentleman standing out in the Manatee River with oyster tongs, pulling them into a crate. So my preconceived notion that the Manatee River, or really this area in general, that was not a source of food, was kind of disproven right there. So again, like, I come back to that shifting baseline thing, is that, like, okay, I had a I had an idea of what I thought it was, but that was wrong, especially now looking into the history and finding numerous accounts of this being a vast resource at the time. So we're industrious people. When we're going to destroy something, we kind of go all out. So this was an interesting thing that I found. This was a copy of an interview that referenced something that John Glazier, and the Glaziers are one of the pioneering families in Manatee County. They said, remember that the Manatee Avenue was originally a sandy road, was eventually paved with live oyster shells from the Manatee River. And I'd always heard that, their shells under the road, and they took them from Indian mounds. So I when I first read this, I wondered, like, okay, is this just a reference to that they took shells from Indian mounds? But it was very quickly clarified when it said that for several months after this paving, the oyster meat rotted, and Manatee Avenue was the most odoriferous street in the whole United States. So that kind of clarified it to me that they were actually going into the river, pulling live oyster beds out of the river. And yes, they knew it was going to stink for a while, and I can't imagine how bad that would have been. But this wasn't just fossilized oyster piles. This was actually pulling this stuff out of the Manatee River. So, not to be outdone, I knew that there had been a lot of historical dredging that occurred in the Manatee River from the late 1800s for navigational purposes, but then for fill material to build the hospital, a lot of that riverfront area there. But I came across these dredge lease and severance records for using state lands for mining, and found that there's the Bradenton Dredging and Shell Company, which operated between 1931 and 1962 on several leases in the Manatee River, had removed 651,000 cubic yards of material, of shell material from the river in those times, which, again, I had no clue that there was that much. And just like for a frame of reference, 1 cubic yard is more than one pickup truck bed full of shell material. So 651,000 cubic yards is a ton of material. So I was able to get copies of a map from 1888 that was created by the Army Corps of Engineers as basically an as-built map of that original dredging that occurred. And I found on that map that they identified subtidal oyster habitat on that river before these things. So they had it like kind of outlined in this little bumpy hatch. So I went through and I kind of put these on a current map, and then turned the areas they mapped as oyster beds as purple. So you can see, like, towards the front, this is like Emerson Point is here, Robinson Preserve is here. There was a couple of small ones out in the river there, but then when we get here to where Terracea Cut is, we get some of these where we get like 12, 13, 14 acre, 20 acres. And then right here between Palmetto and Bradenton, this was about a 70-acre oyster bar in the middle of the Manatee River. Then another one back here towards the town of Manatee. And then they basically stopped mapping them as they went through there. But I mentioned that I had those records of the dredging with a lot of help from the State Division of Historical Resources. We were actually able to track down the actual lease area maps. And when I overlaid those on top of those areas mapped from 1888, they pretty much all matched up perfectly. So we know that there's those old maps from 1888 had these resources shown on there. And we know that through the commercial dredging for aggregate material that happened in the 19th century, that's where they went. And I gave this presentation down in Sarasota for a community group down there a few weeks ago. And I wanted to like make sure that like just to know that this isn't necessarily just a Manatee River thing. A really fun thing is when you start digging into these resources and use like oysters and Sarasota, like the keyword oyster and then Sarasota, you get a whole bunch of other cool stories that pop up like that. One of them was the Sarasota oyster or oysters taken from Sarasota Bay were marketed very heavily as having a sweeter and finer flavor than all these other dirty oysters that you get around here. So, but I just was interesting is like what this is a oysters a la Florida to use with the magnificent Sarasota oysters, and it's a really nasty tasting looking recipe where you pull a bread loaf in half and put oysters in there and then add cream into it and then a little salt and pepper and then bake it again. So if anybody ever wants to get a loaf of bread and some raw oysters and try to make something from old times, let me know. I'll get you a copy of this and you can try it out. But this was another interesting one. It came from the St. Pete Times in 1938, but it talked about Sarasota County realizing that they basically that we've destroyed our oyster resources, but had plans to do a complete rehabilitation and got some money put together to do it. But it's funny because it was like it's a lot of the same mistakes some people make now. Is that their idea was that they would take small oysters that are alive and move them into these old areas without taking into consideration that they had changed the hydrology to those old areas, and that's the main reason that oysters are not growing there. Besides physically removing all the culture material that they grow on, you've changed the water as well. So this is just another one from 1908, but talked about hardy fishermen retired like the 20 large boats filled to the gunwales with oyster bar in Tampa inside of 6 hours, and a small fleet loaded with the bivalves in a few hours on the Sarasota banks. So it was a commercially harvested, unsustainable. It's free money on the bottom, and people went and got it, and they didn't put it back. The other thing just to kind of keep in mind too is that there's been a lot of hydrological alterations to all of our river systems and creek systems around here. The Manatee River is certainly subject to that, both from the amount of people. You can see like there were not many people here in 1900, especially compared to now where we're going to be, approaching 500,000 people in Manatee County. We're drawing a lot of water out that would otherwise be freshwater flows that would contribute to the river. We've also dammed the river and we've dredged the front of the river. So the salinity regimes that would have harbored oysters in a completely natural and pristine situation would have a lot fresher water closer to the mouth of the river because that wasn't dredged out to allow that exchange to happen so easily. So when you start considering that and knowing that there's this Goldilocks zone where these oysters grow, then you can start to see where, okay, maybe there was enough oysters toward the mouth of the river that you could have blocked some navigation like that. So now that I've talked completely about how we've destroyed this resource, I want to show you some things that there are areas where oysters are still there and there's potential to grow a lot more. So I love models, but I really love doing pilot projects much better. So in May 2019, when we first started getting this idea, I got with Jay Leveroni at the Sarasota Bay Estuary Program, and I said, "Hey, I want to test this. What do you think?" And he said, "Well, why don't you get a dish tray, fill it with shells, and put them in areas you think might hold oysters." So we went from the mouth of the river all the way up to the Fort Hammer Bridge, and every 2 miles we put that shell tray down. And this is the same set of shells you saw in that last video 15 months later. And this is by the Carlton Arms Apartments. And that loose shell in 15 months is just absolutely covered with live oysters and live mussels. And some of these are like at market size or beyond, like 3 and 4 inch oysters that grew just in that 15-month time period. But one of the things I like it is you can see like there's great blue heron footprints in the mud around that. So when the tides are low, they're drawn to this area to forage. Something just made that big puff of things. There's snail eggs. There's just so much life that comes there. So once I realized that, like, you know, if you just return that culture material that was systematically mined out for removing the live oysters for food and then removing the oyster shell that remained for aggregate material, that there's a lot of potential to do good oyster restoration work. So I mentioned before that the areas in the river, kind of the spatial zones that would have been ideal prior to the alterations to the hydrology, weren't there. But like I started seeing in areas near I-75 especially, where these really clean, crisp, clear aerials started coming out in about 2021, 2022. And I started noticing these little domes out in deep waters in the Manatee River. So I checked the state keeps a map of all oyster resources, and they didn't have any of this stuff mapped. So I was like, those kind of look like little oyster bars out there. So we hopped in a boat and went out to these things, and sure enough, we started seeing them. So we got with the folks at FWC who are in charge of doing all that mapping, went out with GPS units, and started mapping all these additional ones we were starting to see out there. And they're not big and extensive. Most of these are 400 or 500 square feet each. But this is I-75, and there's a lot of these just little remnant patch oyster bars. And the one thing I noticed is like there's a large one right here, and this is the channel that goes into Colony Cove. And then associated with the power lines, there was basically a line perfectly aligned with the power lines themselves that had these oyster bars growing on them. So what I realized when we started looking at these closely is that these oysters were starting to grow here in this area where they dredged the channel out and hit some limestone and cast it to the side. The limestone was that hard surface, and oysters started to grow on them. On the power lines themselves, wherever the pole or the guy line went down, they added limestone riprap for stabilization around those, and those were just absolutely covered with oysters. And then what was really interesting is I found like a lot of these like smaller ones, and there's a lot of them that are about the same size. I was really curious as to what the origin of these actually were. And what I found in several of them is that if you really dug into the middle of it, you would find the remnants of an old crab trap. So I got some photos of that later, but this was just another interesting part was like I talked about like along the power lines. This is a zoomed in version. You can see like at the poles and the guy wires, there's these oyster domes or oyster bars that have formed all around those and then like spread out beyond where the original lime rock was. But there was this one that was like perfect, nice oyster bar, no telephone poles or anything like that. So I was kind of confused. As I went back and looked at some of the older aerials, I saw where in 1978, when that power line crossed in that area, it was a wooden guy line, and it was actually located exactly where my mystery reef was now. So again, it was there, but the power lines were in different places at that time. So that was kind of a cool little thing just to find that. And this is a photograph looking. This is at the top of the mystery reef, looking back south to the other reefs that are out there. This is on a really low tide that day too. But that was just one of the things that kind of really proved is that like if these oysters are giving the opportunity to have that culture material reintroduced, they grow on it very well. And this is one of the crab traps that I mentioned out there, and you can see just a little bit of the chicken wire kind of. This was vinyl coated chicken wire poking through right there, but those things were absolutely covered in oysters, and they grow off, and then they start to break off and then fall to the side, and then more oysters grow on that. This was one of the more interesting ones. These were 3 gallon planting pots, where just this little corner of it was sticking up that wasn't buried, and that was enough to start a clump of oysters growing on it. Old tires, which unfortunately are fairly prevalent in some of those areas in the river, but when they're in those areas that are at the right zone, really big oysters growing very happily even off of those tires. So as you know, as we're doing this, and like I started this when I was at Manatee County probably 8 or 9 years ago, and started getting some Restore Act funding geared towards this project, but have been looking at trying to figure out, if you're going to try and do large scale oyster restoration in the Manatee River, to basically zone those areas. So this is a culmination of that effort over the past 8 or 9 years, with each one of these dots or flag posts representing where I have, or part of the project team has, specific observations where we basically asked ourselves, like, is this area good for oyster restoration, depending on the biology, but also on the permitting aspects and too. So you can see that if you're looking for large scale restoration, there's definitely a lot of greens in this area that's just east of I-75, and then it gets greener again right there where the Braden River comes out. But again, less so towards the mouth of the river. And I'll talk a little bit more about that why. But like with this kind of master plan that I'm working on, with ORE and in partnership with Manatee County, where we're going to start trying to do some of these large and bring back these like 60 and 70 acre reefs to bring back all of that ecosystem service value, is pretty much going to be from downtown Greenbridge area back upriver to really about the Colony Cove area, where you have some really large areas where the elevations are right and the existing resources there as far as seagrasses are very, very limited. So you'd be able to permit it and be able to get projects like this done. So I had mentioned, historically, like even mapped and like all the narratives talked about more oysters being present towards the mouth of the river. But oysters, like everything else, they have predators. Some of the main ones driving the ecology of oysters in the Manatee River is this little guy here, which is called an oyster drill, crown conchs, starfish, obviously blue crabs, but they're kind of all over the river. So in those higher salinity areas, that's where these predators really prefer to be. So when you get further upstream or further closer to like the freshwater inputs that come out of the Braden River, the pressure from these predators is greatly reduced. So that's where you start to get these subtidal oyster reefs that grow at scale on the bottom, and they're multi-generational, and you get very large oysters, it's interesting. But like if you really pay attention, you'll say, well, Damon, I've been to Emerson Point Preserve, and I can see on the mangrove roots there where there's big cakes of live oysters there. And that's where this photo on the bottom right was taken. And then this is basically the opposite of that. It's a stick coming off the bottom, an old piece of iron actually, with just a crown of oysters on the top of it. And this is interesting, but it really has to do a lot with these, especially these snail predators, because they don't swim. So if it's hanging off of an oyster or off of a mangrove root, it's not connected to the bottom. So it's got an added level of protection from most of the predators that are going to come to it. And then even on these ones that have this connection, when it's at that intertidal zone, because it's intertidal, that water comes down, and that's when it's going to be exposed to things like wading birds and those other things. So these snails and everything else, they don't hang out to dry out. They're going down. So you have these like very narrow zones of oysters in intertidal bars where oysters can still do well, but it's not like large areas on the bottom as historically existed toward the mouth of the river and currently exist further upstream near I-75 in the mouth of the Braden River. So like this part of it, like these ecological drivers, is always this really exciting part to me. This thing with the mangrove roots, there was I was really just trying to kind of understand how often you see these oyster drills, especially. And I put on a snorkel and I was looking at mangrove roots on the backside of Longboat Key, and I noticed that there were, two mangrove prop roots that came down right next to each other. One of them caked with oysters, one of them almost completely picked clean, and you could see that there was some old barnacles and old oysters that were attached, but nothing there anymore. And it was interesting because the difference was the one that had the oysters did not reach down and touch the bottom. The one that was picked clean of oysters went all the way to the bottom. And then when I looked at it really closely, I was able to pull 4 of these little oyster drills off of that. So they were like actively hunting anything else that started to grow in that. So those predator pressures are real. So one of the things we really want to do is try to find these areas where those predator pressures and the physical conditions of that river are most appropriate to grow these large areas. And that's really what that the map with all the pretty colors on it that showed the big green areas by I-75 was really showing. And then from that, permitting is obviously a huge challenge with these things. I've been able, through Oyster River Ecology, we have a permit to do 10 acres of oyster restoration. And when I was doing that, I kind of drug Manatee County along into it because I'd already done all the field work and was having the state agency people that come down to review this were already had the trip. So we said, let's inspect this area and see if Manatee County can get a 6.2 acre over here. We were going for a little bit larger, but we found a little bit of existing oysters there. So with these, we have to follow a lot of, like, there cannot be any blade of seagrass within 50 feet of this. There can be no existing oysters within this area. So it took a lot of one of the members of my board, Rusty Chinnis, was nice enough to drag me behind his boat for weeks at a time until we found these areas that had sediment conditions that we thought would support oyster restoration, but also lacked all of the environmental resources to be able to go through this permitting avenue we did, where we don't have to worry about providing seagrass mitigation, and the sovereign submerged land issues are all handled by the state with that. So 16.2 acres of oyster restoration is a really big deal. That's way more than any other agencies within our 4 or 5 county area here have been able to do. The challenge is going to be implementing those projects, because it's really just say, yep, we're gonna do 10 acres of oyster restoration. But I've mentioned that the way to fix this is to reintroduce that hard material, whether that be shells or rock or whatever else. If you look out over what 10 acres looks like and think, I've got to cover all this with rocks, you can realize that gets really expensive really quick. So that starts to look, it takes several different forms. A lot of the larger projects that are done in the Chesapeake and in Texas and the Panhandle are these types where you have, it's eerily similar to the old photograph of the shell dredging. It's the same process, but in reverse, except for it costs a lot more to do now. Where this one, they're taking rock rubble and just reintroducing that back into these areas, and that's that hard substrate to do. I mentioned, I got my eyes were open to this sort of stuff at that Lefis Key. So every project I try to do, I try to have there be a lot of public involvement, and especially get the kids involved with this sort of thing. So one example of that is all of the oyster reefs that are internal in Robinson Preserve. They were add-ons to that project because we started to see that at the bridge abutments at that intertidal zone, we started to see that oysters were growing there. So we went out and mapped the bottom and found that okay, if we add a 4 to 6 inch veneer of oyster shells, we will have that subtidal or that intertidal elevation, and we can get these oysters growing there. So this was all kids and multiple volunteer events, and Karen and her crew at Around the Bend did probably a dozen of these things with me over the years. But it's a really fun way to do that, and it's not just feel good. These are the kinds of projects where these kids come out, they're a part of this, and this was 6 or 8 years ago, and right now those oysters are out there at Robinson Preserve, still filtering, still providing habitat. So it's one of those things where once you do this, it's relatively permanent, and it just continues to provide good on into the future. So I mentioned before, the big challenge after getting the permits to this is getting the money put together to actually put down that scale of culture material back on the bottom to allow a substrate for those oysters to land on and grow. So I have been developing something called a vertical oyster garden anchor, and there'll be some photos of it in a second here. But really, this was based on old aquaculture techniques. This is not something new. It's just, people have been growing oysters for food for thousands and thousands of years. And I've always thought if you could just grow them on a stick and not pick them off to eat them, they fall off, and you should be able to build an oyster bar that way, if you're not harvesting them for food. And since you're never going to want to harvest oysters in the Manatee River for food, it's not an approved harvest area. Don't anybody ever eat manatee. Don't ever eat oysters out of the Manatee River, all of you, please. But as I started looking around, it's like, there's these things, where they've been doing this in China for thousands of years, some existing projects in South Carolina and coastal Georgia where they're just putting tons and tons of bamboo sticks out, which are really cheap and really easy to get, to see if they'll grow on wood. And then areas in South Carolina where this is a pretty common method to grow oysters for food, where they'll just put a bunch of PVC poles out there, and they'll grow the oysters off of that and then break them off and then let them regrow again. So this is a video that kind of shows how that works.
Here's how it works. Instead of oyster shells,
Is the video sound coming in for you guys?
staff and volunteers should in restaurants. They are taken to a stop line and just
Very spotty.
I'll talk over it. So basically, we take the shells and we drill holes in them, put them onto sticks, and we call them vertical oyster garden anchors. We make a lot of them. I've had a lot of kids making these already. It's fun. I do have red bags that I use for this. So we put these into these areas that we have permitted. Putting them in on 1 foot centers.
Great. AKA.
And this is the concept part. We haven't had them out there long enough to see if this part actually happens like we think it will. But based on the growth rates that I saw on the trays full of shell, I think this is the direction this is going to go. So one of the things that I've always been the guy in the room that talks about this, where it's like, okay, we'll do an oyster project, and it's like a little quarter acre here and a little quarter acre there, where knowing that we have on maps that showed oysters at hundreds of acres in the Manatee River, that weren't maps to map the oysters. That's just what they happened to run across. That we need to start thinking big and make these meaningful projects that will last on for generations. So kind of knowing that cost was going to be one of the challenges, I worked with this engineer at Environmental Science Associates in September of 2022 to put together based on current material costs and permitting and everything else, what it would cost to cover an acre with 6 inches of lime rock. That cost came out to $635,600 per acre, which was kind of a punch in the gut. But when I started looking around at other projects, that's what a lot of these things are costing. So that's when I kind of jumped into, okay, we need to find a way to bring those costs down, because if oysters are they're ecosystem engineers, if we just build the skeleton for them to start going off of, if we're putting them in those right places where they grow quickly, they should be able to build the reef themselves if we just provide them the framework to do that. So my first thought was, well, I've seen them grow on mangrove roots. Mangrove roots are wood. Pine stakes are pretty cheap. You can buy them by the truckload for hub stakes. So I put a bunch of them out there in the Manatee River and started to see oysters growing on them, and I was starting to get really excited. But then within 8 months, the boring worms had ate into those things and turned all of that wood into absolute sponges to where they were falling apart, and the oysters weren't able to hold on to that. So that was a big no, was a quick one I learned there. So this is kind of where I've landed from that, is to actually use the shell material, drill holes through it, and then put them onto galvanized steel stakes. And this, like, worms can't get to this at all, and they're a lot easier to transport. The real benefit to this over the wood stakes is that the actual installation of these is incredibly easy because they have this circle top pin and you can just push them into the ground. And for me personally, it's easy enough for a kid to do, and I want to have a lot of kids to be able to do this sort of stuff. So, and looking at these, like the material costs and the labor costs, instead of the 600 some $1,000 per acre, these come down back to around 200,000 some per acre. And that really matters a lot. And this is the reason why, is because finally some of the local management agencies are recognizing that we need to be going much larger on oyster restoration than a lot of, than we have thought about in the past. Because like we've kind of all been victim to that shifting baseline issue. So this table's taken from the Tampa Bay Estuary Program's 2020 Habitat Management Plan update. And in this one, they've mapped the current extent of oysters in the Tampa Bay watershed at 171 acres, and recognize a 2030 target of an additional 50 acres at 221, with their 2050 goal being adding 300 additional acres of oyster habitat. And they seem to be relying on me, as what they keep telling me is that, we just need to get this all done in the Manatee River. But there, like I said before, there's this story of massive depletion of this resource. Is not just Manatee County, it's not just the Manatee River, it really is everywhere. And so this is just a kind of a cost difference between those two methods. If you went with that margin backgo method at 300 acres, it's a $190 million project. That's too much money. That's like new bridge over the Manatee River, or maybe a football stadium money. And not enough people love oysters enough to try and get that. Where we're looking at these other methods, where we're putting them into these right places and building the framework for them to grow, and basically employing the oysters themselves to do the work, that's $64 million. And just as a frame of reference, with the bipartisan infrastructure bill funding grants that have been coming out for the last year, they, to multiple projects, but they award well over that every year on those projects like that. So,
Damon,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Why do you want so much scale for this? Is it to protect the mangroves and the shoreline? I just wanted to, because it's so important what you're saying. Why do you want 300 acres by 2050?
One, because of the ecosystem services that oysters provide. So it's not build oysters to protect mangroves. It's build oysters to restore oysters, because we all recognize that mangroves are important and we need to save the mangroves and save the water quality. But we never gave oysters credit because nobody knew that this was such an extensive resource and that they belong in this ecosystem. So for me, it's restoring oysters to protect oysters, and also to regain the benefits of those systems that are documented and pretty well quantified in a lot of the research that's gone on for the massive scale projects that have gone into the Chesapeake. But when I first started looking at this, I thought like, oh, those are Chesapeake Bay projects. We wouldn't do those. We're not an oyster area. But as I dug in, I was like, no, we were an oyster area. It's just that we completely destroyed that resource, and we did it over 100 years ago, so nobody talks about it. So that, to me, that's why it's always so important to me to dig back into the history of this. So yeah, for me, it's there's benefits to mangroves and fish and everything else, but it's mostly a benefit to the oyster resources. And really, I think the other resource that will probably most likely benefit the most from this would be seagrasses, because you're basically putting a natural filter at scale, large enough to, like, a filtration. If you did 300 acres in the Manatee River, I've ran a quick like a back of the napkin calculation on this, but if you put 300 acres of oysters in the Manatee River, that filtration capacity is enough to filter the entire volume of that river in under 2 weeks' time. So there's, and like the Chesapeake is one of those, like, when they look at that, like, system wide, they do those calculations on the entire water bodies calculation for water filtration turnover rates. So to me, it's like we need not sell ourselves short on this. And it's funny because it's like these areas, like the areas where it's prime to do oyster restoration, have, in almost every water body around here, have shifted from their historic areas because we've made so many alterations to the watershed above it. So where we used to have like really slow pulses of water come out, we might now have really heavy quick flows come through. Like, I mean, all around the celery fields, you see like all those big ditches and everything else. We've re-engineered everything to kind of push out, but those prime areas do still exist. It's just a matter of looking to see where those areas actually are. And I'm happy that, like, I gave this presentation back in December, and some folks from Sarasota County in the office, and we've been talking about, like, in this context of like where those are, to try and, like, the opportunity exists. It may not exist in the same footprint as it did 150 years ago because of the changes we've made, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't look to be able to restore that resource, but maybe in an area that still works, because we're never going to be able to fix that water. We're not going to take out the dam at Lake Manatee so that Damon can grow oysters further downstream. So it's a matter of kind of finding out where you can do these things and then actually just doing it. So Karen mentioned, thank you for mentioning, I'm also taking part in the Giving Challenge. It's a really important time for us because we're existing just on a little bit of fee-for-service work and some grant work that are grants that have come into us. Some really exciting things for us, and this is very stressful for me, is that I know, like, there's money in the bank for me to operate for at least 6 months out, but in the next couple of months, I'll hear back on some really large grants that will fund, like, larger boats to be able to get kids out, and a lot more of the equipment and material to be able to start implementing this stuff at scale. So as those things get going, it's like we'll definitely be trying to increase our donor base, and then be able to bring more federal dollars and state grants to these projects locally. And that's one thing that, like, a lot of people don't know about with the Robinson Expansion Project and the Perico Project is I've always been, like, out front about all the biological and the historical research and the implementation of those projects. Most of the work I did, and probably some of the most important work I did, was the grant narratives and writing up the stuff to get the funding to be able to do that stuff. That just makes for a really boring presentation, so I don't usually talk about that sort of stuff so much. So I'm happy to take any questions from anybody. I feel like I took all the oxygen out of the room running my mouth that long, but
I
Damon,
think there are a
thank
lot
you.
of questions in the chat, actually.
Yeah.
Damon, thank you very much. I want to just ask you once again, the major reason for scale on the oysters is to clean the water, right? I mean, because we can't eat these oysters. So even if they're scaled, right? Or if they're,
Someday we can.
What?
We'll have to really change the direction we're going to be able to eat these oysters.
Yeah,
The Manatee River is impaired for fecal coliforms. So we'll really have to get City of Bradenton on board on stopping their sewage discharges for one. But again, like all of the septic systems that are upstream, a lot of the pet waste and those sorts of things that contribute to those fecal coliform things there. But Margie, to answer your question maybe a little more thoroughly, is that the habitat values to me, like, it's worth restoring oysters for the sake of restoring oysters, because there used to be large scale oyster habitats in these systems, but oysters themselves are a keystone species. So by restoring those oysters, we're increasing the amount of, like, even for birds, it's like just the biomass of available forage for all of, like, for instance, there's a wood stork colony at the dot dash, the little islands at the mouth of the Braden River. Those would benefit not necessarily, but especially these subtidal ones where they're very rarely going to be able to get down and forage on it. But this just creates that much more biomass of life that is part of the ecosystem, that everything benefits from that. So yes, the water's clear, and that's usually the one that, people see the two fish tanks and they latch onto that. Because it's a very visual thing to see like that. But between that and like when I've tried to get out in front of every stakeholder group possible with this, including the commercial fishermen that use this area. And when I went out and presented that at the organized fishermen in Florida meeting, and then at like a fish preserve with that group there, and they're 100% behind it, because they know, like, yeah, when we put traps near close by oyster reefs, we catch a lot more blue crabs out of that. So yes, there's more than one reason for sure, and you can change the projects to benefit certain things. Like one of them, for instance, if you wanted to do a project that benefited oyster catchers, instead of focusing on doing the subtidal reefs, you would do intertidal reefs that would provide additional forage area. And that's one of my favorite ones is like those we did about 1 acre total of new oyster bars in Robinson Preserve. And like I've been out there and seen, like, on oyster bars that we created with volunteers, and then there's oyster catchers out there foraging off of those oyster bars, and there's it's like, heck yeah, thank you for coming out there and giving me that smile, Mr. Oyster Catcher, because it's like they validate that effort. So
that's
and then
great.
the other thing, like, I really love about especially these oyster projects is that you get them done, you don't have to maintain them, and they keep doing that work forever. And the really awesome thing with oysters in particular is because they grow upwards. So even with sea level rise, they will continue to grow upwards and be able to maintain that ability to kind of hold the fort down. So it's just an awesome organism, and I don't know, there's a whole bunch of reasons I want to restore them.
This sounds so exciting. Thank you so much. I love this presentation, and I love that you started with the history and are going back to what was native here or ecologically sound from the beginning. So thank you so much for this. Kylie Wilson asks, what is the neatest creature you have spotted on oyster beds in the Manatee River?
So I like the weird ones. One of the things is when we started getting, like, because we surveyed the whole river and in the context of oysters. So there's two really. When we got about to where, like, downtown Bradenton area, there are some areas that never got dredged. So one is where the existing railroad bridge is, the Tropicana train crosses. That never got dredged because there was a train bridge going across there. And then a little bit further to the east, near where Riviera Dunes goes, there's an old railroad trestle that's gone. But those areas, they're generally higher salinity, but there's shell on the bottom there. So like I started like getting down there, I started to see these bright orange clumps stick up. So when I got that on there, like what, why are these shells all bright orange? There's a boring sponge, and it's one of those things that you just like, you don't normally see that kind of thing. And it's like I had to figure it out. But then now that I've looked it up and I recognize it, I see it on rocks and all sorts of stuff all over the place. But it is like bright orange, like painted orange, and those are down there on the bottom.
So Jean Doobie asks, will large-scale oyster restoration help minimize red tide?
So it's certainly a part of the solution. I don't like, there's a lot of groups that'll go out there and say, if we put clams in the water, it's going to eat red tide, or if we hang some oysters off your dock, it's going to eat red tide. That's not true. It will help, and oysters that exist on the bottom certainly help because they take available nitrates and nitrites from the water column that feed red tide, and they basically feed that to bacteria below them, which convert it to nitrogen gas so that it can't be resuspended and become biologically available the next time there's a storm there. So that's not to say that, okay, if we just do enough of this, it's going to go. We have to stop this stuff at the source. We need to fix our stormwater management systems, our sewer discharges that are going on there. There's oysters alone can't fix it. It's got to be everything. And there's been some, I know, like there's a lot of bad news in the environment lately, but with a lot of like the forcing of Sarasota County and City of Sarasota, they're getting it together as far as their discharges, and their these things are going to these like high levels of treatment before their discharge, and it is helping. We're seeing like increases in seagrasses, reductions in macroalgae. Those all things go hand in hand with less likelihood to have those major red tide events like we had in 2018 and 2019. But if we can avoid things like sewage discharges and piney points, we'll be all the better for that. But long answer for oysters are going to help, but they won't do it all.
And just Jean was asking, and I just want to clarify. So, I mean, I eat what are so-called local oysters, but I sure hope they're not. It sounds like they shouldn't be from Sarasota Bay or from Manatee River, right?
So there is, I'm glad you brought that up, because there is the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services actually regulates that, and they test for water quality and on a regular basis, and they make the determination of what is a harvestable area for shellfish and what's not. So there's actually, if you Google search in maps for Florida shellfish harvest areas, you can see the areas that are approved for shellfish harvest. And what's really interesting, a lot of people don't know this, is that there are commercial aquaculture growers of oysters that exist in Manatee County. And as I've been, doing this, like one of my permitting processes is actually through the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. And like, I really got to learn a lot more about that, the oyster aquaculture and clam aquaculture things. And it's an interesting thing, because it's like they're grown locally. I'm starting to get some of the shells from some of these people to use in my restoration program too. But again, it's like most people don't know that you can get Manatee County oysters from local wait, there it is, Calusa Oyster Company, that has leases, but they don't grow them on the bottom. They grow them in floating cages, and they're growing them in those high salinity areas, because there's none of these low salinity areas that are within those designated harvest areas. So they grow them basically in cages that are protected from all those predators that like the high salinity areas. But yeah, there's that. There's a lot of people that are doing clams in this area.
But are they toxic? Are they good to eat? I mean, I guess they are if they're commercial.
Oh yeah, they'd be out of business really fast if they started.
I would think
poisoning
so.
people.
So how do
Yeah.
they keep them from not being polluted?
they're in areas that are tested and are not polluted. I
Oh,
guess
okay, you
the
said that.
solution to pollution is dilution, and these are areas that are out there, like they're like at the in lower Tampa Bay, out like near Mariposa Key and Joe Island, like offshore of the state park. And they regularly test water quality in those areas and know that, like, you know, you're not going to have issues there. And if they test them and they do, they shut those areas down.
I posted
Damon,
a
are
link.
they, oh, sorry, Karen.
That's okay. I posted a link to the map if anyone's interested.
Damon, are those what we know as Gulf oysters that we see in fish shop, seafood store? Well, what's the
So,
variety? Or is it
In
ju-
our area,
Mhm.
they're Eastern oysters. There's
Eastern.
everybody has a variety, and usually it's the same genus and species, but they will change what they're called based on the waters they came out of. So just like they did in the 1910s when they were marketing that Sarasota oyster, it's the same species of oyster that grows in these areas, but they call them something different based on where they grow. There are other types of oysters that are grown on the West Coast, those great big ones that I can't remember the name of right now. But in our area, there's two species of oysters that grows here. There's the Eastern oyster, and there's another one called a tree oyster that grows kind of intermixed within these. It just has like a really skinny body. And actually, I've found one of them like near Bully's Creek years ago, and then found another one near Emerson Point not long ago. You don't see them very often, but it's really kind of interesting because, like, when you look through these historical documents, there was a long time where they would call them raccoon oysters, and it was treated as a different species of oyster for the longest time because there were these little oysters that you would found like in these like high salinity environments, like at the mouths of the river and in the high salinity portions of the bays. And the only reason they were small is because they're in those higher salinity areas, and they don't grow into multi-generational bars because something is eating them every single year. So something comes by, eats them, then each year there's a new spat set, so that you basically get a repeat of year-old oysters over and over and over again, because there's that constant predator pressure in those areas, as opposed to the areas that are like that have that more ideal salinity and therefore pressure or predator pressure dynamic, where those things can actually grow up into really large oysters. So it's the
Wow.
same species, they're just smaller because of the awesomeness of the ecology that's going on around them.
Damon, you really are proving that you're our beloved best local ecologist. I can't tell you how fascinating this is to learn all about oysters, and I'm so glad you're out there moving the ecology back where it belongs. So I wish you all the best for your efforts, and please think of contributing to him. I want to close with Paula Griffin putting in the chat that she just saw a haiku in a book saying, quote, "a mangrove island anchored in oysters."
I
So,
like it.
yeah, I do too. Thank you so much for all that you do, and thank you, everybody. For next, I just want to go briefly for the next month rather. We're going to have Mary Hardy, who's executive director of the Friends of Myakka River State Park. And she'll also be talking about the ecosystem that's Myakka State Park with photos and storytelling. So I hope you'll join us for that as well.
And don't forget, tomorrow is the Giving Challenge starting at noon. So
That's right.
Sarasota Audubon and Oyster River Ecology.
And we need to vote tonight, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
I will be sending to the members who are in attendance. You will be getting an email within about a half hour. So
Super.
Damon, thank you so much. You're a superstar in our region.
I'm just having fun.
No, we consider you one of our superstars, and it's just such a pleasure to have you. And I think I'm going to see you tomorrow at the lunch at Michael's on East.
Oh yeah, I'll be there running my mouth there too.
Okay, talking some more. Okay.
all right.
Yeah.
Thanks so
Good night,
much.
for
everyone.
having me. I
Good luck
appreciate it.
with the Giving Challenge too, Damon.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.